Well, welcome to the lecture on fixed and variable costs. Okay, what we're going to be doing in this lecture is looking at some of the fundamentals of what is a cost, how are costs different, are there different types of costs, and comparing and contrasting what those are. And there's basically three types out there. One will be fixed, variable, and then these unique hybrids of both, and we're going to be talking about all three. Before we go into that, though, I want to start with a little caveat, and that is cost control is such an important function of your job as a healthcare manager, a healthcare decision maker. You're often accused of being a bean counter or just concerned about the numbers, which is true. But I always remind folks that without the counting of beans, without the examination of numbers, the wonderful things that we do for our patients and for our communities that we serve simply don't exist. You have to have a solid foundation. A organization has to be financially solvent in order for it to deliver these important healthcare components to a population or to individuals. So it is really, really critical. Nurses don't work for free. Doctors don't work for free. You can't buy CT machines for nothing. All of these things cost a significant amount of dollars. They represent a cost that has to be covered typically through patient revenues. So managing of this is extraordinarily important. In addition to all the other things that you'll be required to do as a healthcare manager with human resources and patient care and patient satisfaction, the list can go on and on. All right, but let's start our discussion on some of the basics about costs, and we'll start off with fixed costs. Fixed costs are something that are known with certainty. Well, I guess as certain as you can be about a particular cost. And they are level. That cost is level within a volume of a relative range. So let's see, what would that look like, or what would be a good example of a fixed cost? I'm sure you can think of some as we're going along here, but let's take a look at a couple of examples of a fixed cost. We'll move this out of the way, and we will kind of go up here. Okay, so a classic fixed cost could be and often is labor. And let's look at this as a graphic representation. So let's say we have our X and Y, and on our X axis we have labor costs. So, or no, we'll have patient visits. So number of patients visiting, or this could be inpatients, etc. Okay, but number of patient visits. And then on our y-axis, we will have, that'll be our dollar amount of our cost. Now, as I said, if you can kind of read here, it's known with certainty, and it's level within that volume, and we're talking about labor. So let's say labor, for example. Sometimes you have to have minimum staffing, and that would be your fixed cost. You know, how many people you actually have on the clock at any one time within a number of visits. So let's say if your number of visits is 0 to 5,000, your labor costs are covering those individuals that you have to hire just to cover basics. Now, after, let's say, a given point outside of that range, yes, your fixed costs can change. You may have to hire additional people to meet the demand. But if you think about it, if you look in a hospital, and many of you are employed within healthcare facilities, there are times where there's just, we have to have at least 3 nurses here. We have to have at least 2 radiologic technologists here. We have to have somebody down in the lab. We have to have somebody sitting at the front desk, no matter whether we have 0 patients or 5,000. That is a fixed cost. Not going to change within that particular range. Let's look at another one. Very similar Again, the graphs will be identical for both. But let's look at a CT machine. CT, or computed tomography. These machines cost in excess of $1 million. You buy that machine, you've had that cost associated with it. It's sitting in that room, whether it's being used or not, is going to have a fixed cost assigned to it. So equipment purchases, those can be fixed costs. There are a lot of other examples, such as rent. That is a common one. Lease. Your lease payment on your building isn't going to change whether you have 300 patients coming in a day or 0. So that is a fixed cost. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty intuitive. Now, let's go ahead and look at what variable costs are. Again, sticking with our theme of intuitive, variable costs will be variable. They'll be related to the volume that you have within your facility. So for example, we'll pick a couple of classic variable costs that we see in healthcare, and we'll put our little chart in here. Again, this will be our number of visits or patients or widgets or whatever we want to call it, but we'll just say visits for now. Kind of getting sloppy there. And this will be our costs. Tongue depressors, rubber gloves, hypodermic needles, anything, those kind of consumables that you see that are related to patient care, those are classic variable costs. So imagine, of course, if you have the more visits, the more latex gloves or non-latex gloves because of latex allergies that you're going to be required. That would be a variable cost. Another variable cost in here, and of course here is the graphic representation of that. Another variable cost to think about is something that I see every day, and it has elements of, and we'll talk about the blending of the two in just a moment, of the fixed and variable, but there are pieces of equipment within the hospital that have a variable component to it. So let's say, for example, if you are leasing a computed tomography scanner, a CT scanner, an MRI scanner, or a copy machine. If you're leasing one of those, you'll have a fixed lease payment that will come in, that you have to make that minimum payment on that machine. But a lot of those items will have a variable cost nature to it. So the more copies that you make, the more you will be charged for that particular month. The more your scanner is used, you will be charged more that particular month from the leasing company. So there are items out there that can have a little bit of the nature of both. And it's something to be aware of as a manager, how these things work. Now, let's go ahead and look at some of these other hybrid structures of variable costs and the fixed costs. All right, our last category, these hybrids, can be a little confusing. And it is more of a matter of semantics, and I would say there is a slight difference when you look at them from a graphic representation, so we will go ahead and do that and have you look at that. I think in the world of management, though, the semi-variable and the semi-fixed cost are often just lumped into the term mixed costs. So if you see that term used, we're really speaking of both about the same things here. So let's look at each one of these with an example that might help clear it up for you. So all right, well, let's change colors here. I'm going to go to red. I'm going to go to our charts here. We're going to have our graph here. And we'll do another one here. My writing is not so great. Again, we'll stick with our little X and Y axis. And we have our dollar amounts, our cost on this side, and we have visits. Kind of hard to see there. On the bottom. Okay. So what would be an example of a semi-variable cost? Let's say, for example, we were talking about labor costs. Um, with labor, you have a certain amount of people you have to have in the facility to keep the door open. So we'll pick on supervisors, managers, because ultimately you got to have that supervisor or that manager, that shift manager there, because they can not only manage the workforce, but when times are when you're at minimum staffing, they also do the job too. They actually go in there and are nurse managers, or again, I'll pick on imaging because that's my area. They'll be imaging managers and they can do a lot of those procedures. So you got to have the supervisor there at a minimum. So the supervisor can handle up to a certain point, and we'll just say like up through this number of visits. But then if business starts getting incredibly crazy, you double your volume, you're managing more people, you have to do more reports, so on and so forth. All of a sudden now, as your visits increase, you got to hire that second manager, and so on. Once you reach another plateau, there comes a point, we've all seen it personally, like when our jobs are kind of maxed out. Now there are times where we just push through because we know that our business is going to balance back out again. But if you're facing increasing business, that is growing, eventually you're going to have to hire new individuals. So I would call this one semi-variable. It has more stair steps in it than what we'll do with semi-fixed. So let's say you are in ultrasound, and I found out, because we're looking to buy 2 of these machines actually, they are incredibly expensive. They're around $100,000 a piece. So each one of those ultrasound machines that you see wheeling around in the hospital are about $100,000 a piece. All right, so, and we want to buy 2 of them. So that's what we're faced with right now here at the college. But say, for example, you have an ultrasound machine, and it can stay relatively busy. You can keep that machine pretty busy throughout a given volume. But if you have a certain volume of patients and you get to here, all of a sudden, right down to here, the machine is constantly busy. You're constantly scanning. You need a new machine. Let's say you're leasing that machine, so it is a cost and not a capital expenditure. So there's that caveat, we're leasing. All of a sudden, wham, you have to go out and get yourself a new ultrasound machine and lease it. Trust me, the least costs on those are pretty expensive too. And now you've got to get that second machine. So the machine has a much longer capacity, can handle more visits than maybe the human manager counterpart can. So really, if I were to see this on a test or a quiz, and maybe you had in there, or a midterm, and you had in here, which one is the semi-variable, well, what I would do is I would look for the one with the more steps in it. And of course, the one that's semi-fixed, quite frankly, just has the less stair steps in it. So hopefully that helps. As I said in the very beginning of this particular slide, they're really the same. And I do like the term mixed cost better than trying to figure out whether it's semi-fixed or semi-variable. But you need to know all 3 of those. So, excellent. So hopefully this sets a good foundation for us with some of the basic definitions of how we look at costs within healthcare. And as always, thank you for watching.